In the previous video, you saw that the main topic of chapter 14, which is wine, is not even acknowledged to be there, according to explanations by Counter-Reformation Rapture Eschatology. They just entirely and completely ignore the entire topic in their explanations of chapter 14, as though it doesn't even exist, despite the fact it is mentioned 19 times in 12 verses in the latter half of the chapter. For a textual saturation of 158%. They simply pretend they do not see it, and hope that is what you do, as well. But it's obviously there, and the main theme of the entire chapter. You saw that all of John's references in section 1 provide contrast statements to things he mentioned in chapter 13. You also saw that, in verse 1, the 144,000 are all male martyrs, because historically it was the males who were killed as enemy combatants, and the women and children were taken into slavery, with many of the virgins being forced into sex slavery. And this was a reference to the actual messianic Jewish martyrdoms depicted as killed on Mount Zion, that followed in the destruction of Jerusalem, in 70 AD. Where many were, actually killed, on Mount Zion. And this text had nothing to do with a future rapture, of either Jews or Christians. You saw that in verse 2, John prophesied the coming of a flood to Rome. A flood, Counter-Reformation Rapture Eschatology does not even acknowledge the existence of, in the text, despite its obvious presence there. And you saw in verse 3, John prophesies the coming of a language barrier, and that the people of the Roman monarchy, he refers to as the first and second beast in chapter 13, headed by the prophesied Pope Sixtus III, aka 666, will not even understand the words of the song the martyrs will be singing in heaven. In verse 4, you saw that his reference to the defilement of virgins was a prophetic reference to the practice of defiling virgins in Rome, and the trial of Pope Sixtus III, who was put on trial for that very thing, and whose trial was dismissed because he cited the story of John 8 in his defense, that he who without sin should cast the first stone. A story that had been fraudulently added to the New Testament, and which pointed to the commonality of the practice in Rome. And in verse 5, you saw that John's prophecy that, the mouth, a prophetic reference to John Chrysostom in chapter 13, would openly practice deceit and blaspheme the Hebrew sacred name of God in his extreme anti-Semitism. And in contrast to this, the 144,000 Jewish martyrs would have no deceit in their mouth, and be without fault, in the presence of God. In section 2 of chapter 14, which runs from verse 6 to verse 13, you saw that John did not prophesy 3 giant Nikes would fly around the world, preaching sermons in the sky. Instead, you saw that, precisely, as he told his readers to understand his symbolism, in chapter 1 verse 9, of the introduction to his book, this section was astronomical dating, for his prophecy in chapter 14. Not 3 giant, pagan Greek Nikes. And that the messages, being indicated by these 3 astronomical events, included the warning that anyone drinking from Rome's cup of wine, worshipping its icon, or taking its ash mark, would suffer damnation for eons and eons of time. A message the Counter-Reformation Rapture Eschatology advocates openly and willfully hide from the public, despite its most severe consequence. And you saw that in section 3 of chapter 14, which runs from verse 14 to the end of the chapter in verse 20, John is not prophesying the harvest of the whole earth, and never even uses the terms earth or world in the Greek text, but instead, John is prophesying the harvest of the vineyard, of the wine of Rome, only. Which is the entire focal point of the second half of the chapter. And that vineyard was the city of Antioch, Syria. The origin of the Nicolaitans, and their arbitrary, deceitful and anti-Semitic substitution of the very blood and flesh of Christ in the Passover meal, which he had commanded all future disciples to observe. And that Rome had actually used its imperial legal power to fully criminalize and punish as a capital offense against the state, resulting in the genocide of hundreds of thousands of Christian Jews. And thus John's prophecy of God's coming judgment, in verses 14 to 20, against Antioch. In this video, we are going to examine John's astronomical dating for Revelation chapter 14, and see the amazing prophetic details that confirm John's prophecies in real history, to the year, and to the day, and even to the hour, of the very events which they prophesied. And you will also see why there is simply no excuse for hiding this information from the public, as counter-reformationists have committed themselves to unethically and immorally do. Because this video will focus on the astronomical dating for the prophecies in Revelation chapter 14, if you have recently begun the series, we will review what the historical interpretation with astronomical dating is, and why it is the original meaning of the book of Revelation, as intended by its author. If you want more of a deep dive on the historical interpretation with astronomical dating, a link to a Bible study on the subject, on the website, ChristmasIsALie.com, is listed in the description section, below this video, which you can read at your convenience. Here however, we will just briefly cover why it is the original authentic interpretation of the book of Revelation, as given by its author. And it is also the oldest interpretation of Revelation on earth. In the following 3 sections, we will cover astronomical dating in theology, astronomical dating in the scriptures, and astronomical dating in history. As you will see, astronomical dating is not a newly invented way to understand the book of Revelation. While counter-reformation rapturists will slander it, and intentionally conflate it with astrology, they will simultaneously attempt to write new books with it, and apply it to futurism, and predict new dates for the rapture, which of course, are never accurate. So they deal with the subject as complete hypocrites. In the second section, you will see that it is clearly commanded in the scriptures, even by Christ. And you don't really have a choice, except to use it, if you wish to obey the texts of Scripture, and the words of Christ. And in the third section, you will see its existence in history, stretches back in time, to even before the formation of the Roman Catholic Church. It is the oldest interpretation of Revelation, in existence. And it bears the historical DNA, of the original followers of Christ, and the authors, of our New Testament literature. We will begin our examination of the subject of astronomical dating next, beginning with the topic of astronomical dating in theology. If the historical interpretation, with astronomical dating, is really the truth about the book of Revelation, why don't more people know about it? Why is astronomical dating not just common knowledge? Why is it not easily found in biblical commentaries, and commonly cited from theological sources? That is a very reasonable question, because obviously, it really should be. It really should be as commonly known as counter-reformation rapturism. It should be. But it clearly is not. No one is making movies about it. No one is selling books about it, and no one is preaching it from the pulpits of modern mega churches or historic cathedrals. So why is this the case, if this is all true? There are some rather shocking historical answers to that question that explain its absence in common culture. And we will cover those in the last section on this topic, astronomical dating in history. But before we get to that, we have to first understand the framework for the vast majority of our common theology on the book of Revelation itself. There are 3 interpretation systems or methods concerning the book of Revelation. We have covered this before in previous videos, but we are going to review this again, in reference to the subject of astronomical dating. These 3 methods are known as preterism, futurism and historicism. Historicism was the interpretation of Revelation during the Reformation, because it was simply the normal biblical approach to prophecy found in the Bible. But this led them to the conclusion, from history, that the rise of the Roman papacy was the prophesied Antichrist. Since this idea was not acceptable to the Roman Catholic Church, preterism and futurism, which were 2 alternative systems, were revived from long-forgotten and ancient heretical sources, and were promoted to fight the Reformation on the subject of Revelation. Neither of which were biblical, and which had their historical origins among Gnostics and Nicolaitans. Nevertheless, they were adopted by the Counter-Reformation, and promoted within Protestant Christianity in collaboration with the Church of England and the Masons. Preterism and futurism, in essence, were propaganda forms of theology. The Jesuit architects of preterism and futurism had no concern or interest, or even intent, in these systems actually being true. The value of these systems, to the counter-reformationists who revived and reframed them, was in spreading their social and political effect only. Preterism claims everything John wrote was aimed at Nero and pagan Rome, and was all looking back, not forward, from John's time in 95 or 96 AD. It argues either that there was nothing prophetic in the book to begin with, because it was a fraud, all written after the fact, and made to look like it had been prophetic, or that it was prophetic when it had been actually written, but it had been written at a very very early date, sometime before 70 AD. Both of those positions are based on simply a willful denial, and even possibly an unethical rejection, of what is plain fact. The first suggestion is held in complete contradiction to fact, because John prophesies in chapter 11, Jerusalem would be given to the Gentiles, 3.5 decades before it happens, so it clearly is not all about Nero, and it clearly has real forward-looking prophecies in the book, that did indeed, even come to pass as prophecy. If you simply wish to suppress that information to your audiences, then you are lying to the public. And that is only one example, of dozens, that easily exist in the book. The second group of preterists, who claim it was prophetic, but written before 70 AD, also hold this position in spite of fact. The scholarly consensus on the composition date, for the book of Revelation, is 95 to 96 AD. So that last suggestion is simply contrary to the historical fact of the book's authorship and composition. There are terms, which exist in the language of the book itself, which were not even in use until this period of history. Placing it back in time, before 70 AD, or even before Nero, is simply wishful thinking. So both of these positions from preterism are simply false claims. If you hold them in spite of the facts, and spread them as the truth, despite what you know to be the truth, then you are just a liar, and nothing more. You are not a scholar. You are a liar. That is pointed out, not to be mean, but because counter-reformationists have no problem with lying, and so they do it extremely frequently, and without a conscience. The vast majority of preterists will clearly fall into that category. You will discover when you talk to them, they won't change their mind, simply because you point out they are mistaken, factually. They are not spreading that view, because it's actually true, to begin with. So don't be disappointed when you discover that's the case. Preterism doesn't concern itself with astronomical dating because it is not trying to date anything with regard to the future, to begin with. Half of preterists don't consider anything in the book of Revelation to be prophetic anyway. Often preterism is embraced by secular university professors because it gives them a way to interpret Revelation without admitting anything in it is prophetic, because perhaps the professor is an atheist, and prophecy is a concept that he cannot accept philosophically as an atheist, even if there are documented examples of its existence. So the professor just uses denial. And preterism gives him or her the ideological framework in which to do that. So they simply willfully ignore the known prophecy in chapter 11 verse 2, and spread preterism as the truth, anyway. But once again, in doing that, you are not a scholar, you are just a liar. Sorry, but that is the hard truth. You should give greater honor to your profession than simply use it to spread your personal lies. Whether you like or dislike prophecy, or agree with the idea of it or not, is all completely beside the point. If you are the scholar you pretend to be, then you should as a scholar honestly know, Jerusalem was given to the Gentiles, as stated in chapter 11 verse 2. Its statement was prophetic, and it did happen, precisely as it was prophesied. If you claim to be a scholar on the subject, and do not know that, then you should stop pretending you are a scholar, because you are actually an ignoramus. It could be but one of two things there. It will not be uncommon to see people who are themselves ignoramuses concerning prophecy, to be quoting preterist academic sources, and thinking they have found something that explains everything. But it doesn't. It just hides it, and often, it is the result of intentional dishonesty. Preterism is a false claim, contradicted by the texts themselves, and by the real volume of history. Preterism is usually favored by academic and political liberals, and often they will not care how truthful or accurate their claim even is. They will hold to it, and spread it, regardless of what any facts may be. The second method, known as futurism, is no better. But this method is usually favored on the other side of the political spectrum, by conservatives. The primary reason they favor futurism is because futurism still acknowledges that prophecy is real. In fact, it turns everything into a prophecy about the end of the world. Because futurism still relies on the existence of prophecy, its community of proponents are divided over astronomical dating. Some futurist, counter-Reformation rapturist preachers will occasionally try to use astronomical dating for futurism to sell a new book and predict a new future date for the rapture, which is virtually what they are always trying to do. But their predictions, based on their self-invented astronomical schemes, never work out because their premise is false, and almost always, they are citing prophecies that have already occurred in history as something future. That is why they never happen. And their homemade self-invented attempts at astronomical dating are vain and fruitless. And always will be. You cannot predict Henry Ford is going to invent automobile production in the year 2028, when it's already happened over a century ago. The historical interpretation, also called the historicist method, is the only true and valid interpretation of Revelation. Counter-Reformationists will rail against that statement because it completely leaves out their two propaganda systems. It leaves them out because they should be left out. Their only purpose was deceit. Historicism is in reality the only interpretation of Revelation, because that is the only one that is defined as such by its own author. And the author's astronomical dating is used to confirm the occurrence of his prophecies in history. Astronomical dating is intrinsically and uniquely tied to the historical interpretation. Because if you use the astronomical dating that John actually really gives you in his text, in any honest way, it will inevitably lead you back to historical events which have already happened. And it will also point you forward to those prophecies which are still yet to come, demonstrating the book is historical in nature, as all prophecies in the scriptures actually are. Futurism and preterism are really both nothing more than counter-Reformation excuses and cheap tricks promoted by them to simply hide the contents of Revelation from the public. They are propaganda lies, originally promoted in Western civilization by self-proclaimed propagandizing liars. That is not stated simply to be an insult. That was actually the ethics system that was openly embraced, publicly confessed, and openly promoted by them as a service to be rendered to God to further their religion. As you saw in John's very prophecies, in chapter 13, concerning the coming of John Chrysostom, the mouth of the beast who advocated deception as a good management skill. Anyone that can read the text in Revelation can openly and easily see that futurism and preterism are simply false claims, contradicted by John's own words. It is just a question of whether or not you are willing to be honest with yourself and the people around you. Revelation chapter 11 verses 2 and 3 are a prime example of that fact, where John dates his own text, and it clearly does not match their eschatological timeline. Stating that the two witnesses come 42 months after the giving of Jerusalem to the Gentiles, which occurred in history in 130 AD. That puts it forward from John's time from preterism, and way back in history from futurism. As does John's clear statement in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, where John openly and clearly states that he is in the tribulation right now, and there are things to soon come, when he is writing the book. And he is clearly not referring to the end of the world. The only tribulation John ever mentions is the one he is currently in, when he is writing the book, in 95 or 96 AD. Two-thirds of the theological universe, both preterism and futurism, when it comes to the book of Revelation, are actually nothing more than intentionally designed counter-Reformation propaganda. And only historicism is valid. Unless you just wish to spread the openly confessed goal of counter-Reformation deception. Futurism's attempt to misuse astronomical dating in order to justify its propaganda form of eschatology are doomed to fail because they are trying to date prophecy which has already happened in history as something that will happen in the future. and to predict things that John never prophesied, namely their fictitious rapture, and their fictitious futuristic tribulation period, that John says he's already in 95 AD. Their prophecy schemes will never work, even with attempts at astronomical dating, because they are promoting medieval counter-reformation propaganda, not biblical prophecy. Astronomical dating is the sole domain of the historical interpretation of the Book of Revelation. And as you will see in just a few minutes, it is the most ancient view, and the only one that is truly biblical. But it clearly identifies the Roman papacy as the prophesied Antichrist. And that is why it remains suppressed and hidden from the public, no matter how true it really all may be. Astronomical dating in the scriptures. When they find themselves condemned in the pages of the Book of Revelation because of astronomical dating, they simply call it astrology. But as you will see, that is an ancient tactic that goes all the way back to some of Rome's earliest Nicolaitan bishops. Astronomical dating for prophecy has nothing to do with astrology. Astrology is defined by Webster's dictionary as, quote, the divination of the supposed influences of the stars and planets on human affairs and terrestrial events by their positions and aspects. End quote. Astronomical dating has nothing to do with astrology. The only thing they share in common is the sky. Astronomical dating simply uses astronomical information in the sky, which is referred to by the author of Revelation, in order to confirm and date the occurrence of his prophecies. It is using astronomical references, like the hands of a giant clock in the sky. This method of identifying the fulfillment of prophecy is a standard practice, and it is found throughout the entire Bible, not just in the Book of Revelation. Astronomical dating is simply using the same astronomical information in the sky that has been used to calculate calendars and calendar dates. But instead of using the information for a calendar date, you are using that information to identify when a prophecy has been fulfilled. It is a concept which is found throughout the scriptures, from the very first book in the Bible, in Genesis, to the very last book of the Bible, in Revelation. And it is cited by Christ himself as proof of his messianic birth. And anyone that attempts to convince you astronomical dating is in any way controversial is probably an advocate of counter-reformation eschatology and simply looking for excuses to justify their own errors. In fact, according to the words of Christ, they are a religious hypocrite. It is not controversial in the Bible. In fact, as you can easily see, it is clearly the only way some prophecies can even be interpreted at all. There is simply no choice if you remain faithful to the language of the texts themselves. Why? Because you are commanded to do it in the texts. And, in fact, Christ calls you a religious hypocrite if you do not. In the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 14, astronomical dating is set forth in the Torah, quote, "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and years." End quote. The Hebrew word translated into the English word, sign, is the word, off, and means a signal literally or figuratively, as in a beacon, omen, evidence, sign or token. Google's definition of the English word sign refers to, quote, an object, quality, or event whose presence or occurrence indicates the probable presence or occurrence of something else. In other words, when you see this sign in the heavens, you know this prophecy is being fulfilled. The presence of astronomical dating in biblical prophecy is commonly seen, visually, every day, all over the world, as a completely common, non-controversial occurrence, whether you realize it or not. Why? Because, when you see these familiar pictures, ironically shown at Christmas, which had nothing to do with either Christ as an infant, or December 25th, you are seeing visually, the history, in the scriptures, of astronomical dating for prophecy. In Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, the Magian Jews, who came from the city of Susa, in the east, had used astronomical dating to recognize the prophecy that the Messiah had been born. And they stated specifically, they came to 1st century Judea because they saw the astronomical sign in the sky, which they referred to as, quote, his star in the east, end quote. And because of this astronomical sign in the sky, they knew he had been born. When Christ was in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Christ asking for a sign from heaven. In response, Christ stated in Matthew chapter 16, verses 2 and 3, quote, he answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O you hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the signs of the times? End quote. He pointed to the heavens, which is the sky, and said, you can read the signs in the sky for weather, and yet you pretend you do not see them, for what prophetic time it is. In other words, Christ was stating they were already there, in the heavens. After calling them hypocrites for refusing to see the signs that were already there, he says he will give them no sign, except that of the prophet Jonah, which was a reference to his burial and resurrection, which he repeats 4 times in the Gospels. So in other words, he called them hypocrites for refusing to acknowledge the signs that were already present in the heavens. This was an open reference to the astronomical dating of messianic prophecies, as was done by the Magian Jews from Susa, who came to his parents' home when he was a toddler. Later, Christ stated in Luke chapter 21, verse 25, speaking in reference to future prophecies from his own day, stated, quote, and there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars. End quote. There is no question that Christ is pointing to astronomical dating for prophecy in this text. And he includes the sun, the moon and the stars, which is everything in the sky. The sun and the moon obviously not only refer to their positions in the sky, but also astronomical events such as eclipses. His reference to stars refer to planets, meteors, and the positional occurrence of constellations. He cites everything in the sky. That is a clear reference to astronomical dating by Christ himself. And John, himself, who is the actual author of the book of Revelation, instructed his own readers to understand his use of the word messenger to refer to the stars, not pagan Greek Nikes. In Revelation chapter 1 verse 20, he openly and explicitly states, quote, the 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 ecclesia and the 7 lampstands are the 7 ecclesia. End quote. So let's just get real and be honest about the book of Revelation. If you are not going to obey John's own instructions in how to interpret his own book, which he is the author of, then how on earth can you possibly think you are going to accurately interpret it? Much less understand its prophecies that use his system of dating and interpretation? If you just belligerently throw away John's own instructions on how to read his own book just because of some personal willful ignorance or theological bias, then it should come as no surprise to you that what you end up with as your interpretation will be nothing short of utter stupidity and ignorance. And that is precisely what Counter-Reformation, futurists and preterists have done. So in a way, they actually got what they deserved. But you don't deserve to suffer because of them any longer, just because of their stupidity and their corrupt ethical behavior. Their sin should not be the cause of your suffering, confusion and continued deception when it comes to the book of Revelation. You deserve to know the truth that God fully intended to give you when he inspired John to write down his prophecies in the book of Revelation. And those who are intentionally hiding them, or have been indoctrinated to do so by them, are hardly the sources you should be consulting to get accurate and reliable information about this last book of the Bible. Astronomical dating is not a recent invention, it is not a personal invention, nor is it the result of some religious leader's mystical revelation. It has been known for centuries upon centuries, and it has been intentionally kept hidden from the public. It was on record as the interpretation for Revelation, with extensive tables to interpret the stars, in full existence and practice, even before the Council of Nicaea, in 325 AD. How do we know this is the case, historically? Because Athanasius, the Nicolaitan bishop of Alexandria, who was present in person, and served as a representative at the Council of Nicaea, makes an open reference to it, in his Paschal Letter 39, and condemns it, in defense of the Roman Empire's status quo, concerning the naming of the constellations, after Rome's state pagan gods. In Letter 39, Athanasius states, quote, "They have fabricated books which they call books of tables, in which they show stars, to which they give the names of saints. And therein of a truth they have inflicted on themselves a double reproach, those who have written such books, because they have perfected themselves in a lying and contemptible science. And as to the ignorant and simple, they have led them astray by evil thoughts concerning the right faith established in all truth and upright in the presence of God." End quote. Because astrology is premised on the rule of the affairs of men by the stars and planets, they were given the names of Roman gods. Christian assimilationists simply used the names of those pagan gods and continued the practice of pagan astrology, with justifications and excuses, just like they continued other pagan practices, uninterrupted. Just like they did, with the continuation of the solstice rituals and feasts, like Saturnalia. The Vatican itself has utilized the services of astrologers throughout history. In fact, if it had been astrology, it probably would not have been condemned until the 16th century, at the very earliest. In an article, subtitled, "A Jesuit Speaks to Irish Astrologers," author Alan Wilmette writes, quote, "In 1993, the late Father Lawrence L. Cassidy, S.J., a Jesuit priest and theologian at St. Peter's College, New Jersey, addressed the Irish Astrological Association, IAA, about their concern over the forthcoming publication of the 1994 English edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which had been rumored to prohibit the study and practices of astrology. Father Cassidy, an astrologer himself, assured them it did not. Many astrologers and their clients are not aware of the Church's permissive tradition on astrology." End quote. The author of the article goes on to report that astrology had been endorsed within the Catholic Church by both St. Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, as well as the Council of Trent. But real astrologists continued to use the names of Rome's gods to make reference to the stars, just like they do today. What Nicolaitan Bishop Athanasius was condemning was clearly not astrology, because these were star tables that renamed the constellations after the names of biblical saints. And neither was it leading anyone from the right faith, because the Nicolaitan Bishop Athanasius from Egypt, with his replacement theology and his Nag Hammadi library Gnosticism, did not represent that. The utter hypocritical irony of this Nicolaitan bishop is that this letter was written for the replacement ceremony Rome invented to replace Passover, which they decided to call Easter. How is the date for Easter determined, since they rejected the 15th day of Nisan? They coincided it with the pagan solar cult equinox. Or in other words, they used a pagan version of astronomical dating to fix the date for Easter. So this Nicolaitan bishop, who was not even qualified to be a bishop, because he was not married nor had a family, simply projected his own error in his complaint. But what Athanasius does do in his criticism is document the existence of a very developed method of interpreting astronomical data with what Athanasius refers to as biblical saints. Athanasius thinks this is wrong, because it is much better in his mind to continue to refer to the constellations by the names of Rome's pagan state gods. But, as you have seen in this series, the practices of associating the constellations with the saints came straight from the book of Revelation itself, where John does precisely that in his prophecies. Because as a Jew, he is discouraged by the Torah from using the names of Rome's pagan gods to refer to them. So, as any biblical Jew naturally would, John simply would not refer to these constellations by the names of Rome's pagan gods when he cites the astronomical information for his prophecy. That is why John uses his own descriptions to cite them, and often echoes Old Testament themes in how he describes them, including references to saints in heaven. And that is why the New Testament Jewish believers had renamed the constellations by the names of biblical saints, and why they had books of tables in their possession to interpret their prophetic meaning. It had nothing to do with astrology, as the hypocritical Nicolaitan bishop, Antichrist, claimed. In fact, John himself prophesies they will slander this in his own statement in chapter 13, verse 6, writing, quote, "And he opened his mouth to blaspheme God, his name and his tabernacle, and those in the heavenly tabernacle." End quote. His reference there to quote, "those in the heavenly tabernacle," is a reference to the association of Old Testament saints with the constellations. The very tables of stars Antichrist was referring to and condemning were simply the reference tables to the constellations given from biblical texts, including the book of Revelation, and of which Christ himself had said there would be signs. This is what one such table looks like. It shows the entire astronomical heavens, laid out as the 12 tribes of Israel. John creates his own template for his prophecies at the beginning of the book, and refers to it throughout his prophecies in the book, which he will do again in chapter 14. His table looked like this, and we have been using it throughout the book. These are the tables of stars that would have been found in these books. But Antichrist not only admits the existence of these star tables in multiple books on the subject, he even documents in his complaint that this information was being used to turn people away from the Catholic Church, which he calls the true faith. But how could a star table that simply renames the constellations with the names of biblical saints turn people away from the Catholic Church? Because there were more to these star tables than Athanasius wants to mention. There were the prophecies from the book of Revelation, many of which had already come to pass, and if you were using astronomical dating at that time, you would have been able to easily demonstrate it. Which, according to Athanasius, there were entire communities which these practices were well underway in doing, to the extent of possessing an entire library of books on astronomical dating for prophecy by the year 367 AD. However, at this same point in history, there was not a single book to be found on the rapture anywhere on earth. The prophetic witness against the rise of Rome's replacement religion was so strong and effective that it required the entire legal force of the Roman Empire to stop, including the use of state-enforced genocide, beginning with the creation of the Theodosius Codex in 438 AD, which targeted these very people for extermination and consigned their books of tables for astronomical dating of prophecy to be burned. This is the reason the Counter-Reformation has irrationally and unethically suppressed the real interpretation of Revelation for centuries, including its use of astronomical dating. Astronomical dating is the key that unlocks the symbols used in the book of Revelation and leads to a precision in historical interpretation. When you match the astronomical data in the text with an event, you can easily see which events do not match the astronomical dating and rule them out. By matching the astronomical data with the description of the event, you can find the event in history, and then the astronomical data will fit like a key. In contrast to astronomical dating, the Counter-Reformationist advocates arbitrarily ignoring John's own instructions and just interpreting everything in the book arbitrarily, either before the beginning of Christian history with Nero, or at the end of the world in a fictitious 7-year tribulation period, effectively avoiding all history, and doing this using inkblot-free association as their primary method of interpretation, and nothing more. And in the background of this stupidity concerning the book of Revelation, they also know the history of what they have murdered and burned and executed. The Jewish believers, with their books of tables of the stars, associated with the saints from the scripture, and leading people away from the Church of Rome, and Pope Sixtus III, were not leading people away from the true faith at all, as the Nicolaitan Bishop of Alexandria claimed. They were the ones who had it. Precisely as Christ prophesies in Matthew chapter 7 verses 21 through 23, the vast majority of Christians in the world today, who call him Lord, have no clue who he is. They are not the Christians of the Bible. In fact, they don't even have the same religion. They have another religion completely. And in the founding of that religion, they exterminated the very community of people who wrote the New Testament and the book of Revelation. They were extinguished as a result of the Roman genocides. That is the testimony of John, in Revelation, concerning the 144,000 martyrs. That is why he writes about them. And why the church will not acknowledge what he wrote. They intentionally hide it from the public. Because what the book of Revelation really reveals, when its real texts are exposed, and its real prophecies are astronomically dated in history, is that what people call the church today is a fraudulent institution which was founded on a genocidal lie. Literally, over the dead bodies of what John calls the original 144,000 Jewish followers of Christ, who are the real, original Christians of the New Testament, and who, according to John, stand in the presence of God, blameless, and without deceit. We will now begin our construction of John's astronomical dating for Revelation chapter 14, and recreate, as the Nicolaitan bishop, Antichrist, called it, a table of stars, over which he would have murdered you for having, and which he would have burned to keep anyone from seeing. Because it shows the signs in the heavens, that Christ prophesied, John described, and that the Nicolaitan bishop Antichrist wanted no one to ever know. We are now going to recreate what Antichrist would have called the star table for the astronomical dating of Revelation 14. We will go through the entire chapter and date its prophecies using astronomical data from the text, and create an historical timeline on which we will match real historical events with John's prophecies and his astronomical data, to see if his prophecies were accurate, and if so, how. We will look at each of our 3 sections of prophecy in chapter 14, one at a time. Beginning with section 1. In section 1, we have 5 verses. What we notice, however, right off the bat, is that verse 1 is a throwback to several chapters earlier, to an event that has already been prophesied and dated. And we notice the same thing in verse 3, and the same thing in verse 5. And between verse 1, verse 3, and verse 5, they are not in chronological order. Because John is writing a contrast to the previous chapter, which is already established on the timeline, and he is making reference to previous events. While there is a timeline to his text, it is not going to be sequential, or in chronological order, in its arrangement, because of this. So while the verses will proceed chronologically through the text, we are not looking at a chronological timeline in its fulfillment, which makes the historical timeline for this text a little more difficult to reconstruct. But because he is referencing previously prophesied events, and we already know where those events occurred, all we have to do is look in the general neighborhood of those previous events, and we should find our astronomical markers, and the historical event that matches his description. Verse 2, however, does contain a new event, which we will have to find. In verse 1, John mentions the lambkin on Mount Zion. As you saw previously, that was a reference to the constellation Aries. On Mount Zion was a reference to the 45-degree incline angle on the planetary ecliptic, which looks like a lamb climbing up a hill, or like it's on the side of a mountain. Thus the reference. Also, as you remember from previous videos, John describes meteor showers in the sky as the martyrs dressed in white in heaven, because elongated streaks of light in the night sky look like white robes or gowns. So in John's first verse we have Aries at a 45-degree incline on the ecliptic, accompanied by the presence of a simultaneous meteor shower, and this event will mark the victory of the 144,000 martyrs over the Roman Empire that martyred them. From the time conversion which was done in the previous reference to this prophecy, we already know this is an event which occurs in the year 476 AD. When we look to find Aries at a 45-degree incline on the planetary ecliptic in the sky, accompanied by a meteor shower, in the year 476, we find that exact occurrence on September 4, 476 AD. So we have located our first marker involving the victory of the martyrs over the Roman Empire. and we will place that first marker on our historical timeline. In verse 2, John describes hearing liars and prophesies a flood. Small floods and seasonal floods happen all the time, but John wouldn't be prophesying just any old seasonal flood. If it is a flood, significant enough to be a prophecy in the Bible, it would have to be an unusually big flood that would get everyone's attention. In other words, it would have to be a flood of biblical proportions that everyone would obviously notice and be awestruck by, immediately making them think of it as an act of God. John's reference to the lyre is a reference to the constellation Lyra. If you Google what month the constellation Lyra is most visible in the sky, it will give you the month of October. And John references hearing the rushing or pouring out of water would be a reference to the constellation Aquarius. So we are looking for an historical event that is a flood of biblical proportions that occurs in October and displays both Aquarius and Lyra descending or being poured out on the western horizon. When we look for that, we find our astronomical markers as John described them on October 17, 589 AD. So we now have our second event involving a flood of biblical proportions on October 17, 589 AD, and we will place our second marker on the historical timeline for the date. In verse 3, John describes the martyrs singing in heaven, but no one can understand what they are saying. He says they are singing before the throne, that's the constellation Cepheus. We have the martyrs, that's a meteor shower. He mentions the four beasts and the elders, that's a planetary alignment on the 24-hour elliptic rotation of the sky. So we are looking for an astronomical event that lasts for 24 hours, involving Cepheus as the center, and meteor showers, along with a string of planets. Like an assembly in heaven, or in other words, an assembly line, rotating around Cepheus, that coincide with a significant historical event, involving the erection of a language barrier, specifically the criminalization of the Hebrew language. When we look for these astronomical markers, we actually find them on April 7, 528 AD. Here is a screen capture of the astronomical activity during the 24 hours involving April 7th. It begins at midnight and continues for the next 24 hours. As you can see, there is the throne Cepheus, and above it are the martyrs, as the Virginids meteor showers. As the martyrs rotate around the throne, the assembly of planets, the elders, rise on the other side. Precisely as John described it in the text. So now we will place our third marker on the historical timeline on April 7, 528 AD. In verse 4, John brings up his discussion about the defilement of virgins. First he says, "These are they, with women do not defile virgins." That is an obvious reference to the constellation Virgo. Then he says, "They are those who accompany the lambkin wheresoever he leads." The text clearly indicates astronomical movement, but constellations, as in the constellation Aries, are the fixed part of the clock. Like the numbers, they do not move. Movement comes from the planets. Christ was given two astronomical values in John's astronomical template. The first was the constellation Aries, which was the fixed reference, but the moving part attributed to Christ was the bright and morning star, a reference to the planet Venus. As he shows in Revelation chapter 2 verse 28, and in chapter 22, verse 16. The fact John makes a reference to movement here in this text, in reference to the fixed constellation Virgo, means he is referencing Christ, here, as Venus, not as Aries. So we have two synchronized astronomical values, the planet Venus, in the constellation Virgo. Then he says, purchased out of the first humans sacrificed to God and the lambkin. The Hebrew term for first fruits is referenced there, but we simplified the translation to make it read what it meant. Why is that significant? Because John references one of the first martyrdoms outside Judea, at the city of Pergamos, which had also been overrun by Nicolaitans, in chapter 2 verse 13. The martyr's name was Antipas. He was literally a first fruit sacrifice, as John is now making a reference to. In chapter 2, verse 17, he says in that text, that he that overcomes, will be given manna from heaven, and a white stone. Both descriptions were associated with the planet Jupiter, because Jupiter appears large and white in the sky. The Hebrew word for Jupiter was tzedek, which means justice or righteousness. So, according to John's astronomical template, which he lays out in the heavens, we are looking for three synchronized astronomical values, Jupiter and Venus, together, as though Jupiter is following Venus, occurring in the constellation Virgo. The constellation Virgo indicates a time frame from August 23rd to September 22nd. We already know this event was connected to Pope Sixtus III, who was Pope from the year 432 to the year 440. So we are looking for this astronomical event, connected to Pope Sixtus III, between late August-September, anywhere from 432 to 440 AD. When we do that, we discover the exact astronomical pattern we have described in our text, on August 23, 440 AD. And now we have the timeline marker for our fourth event, which we will now put on our historical timeline at August 23, 440 AD. In verse 5, which is the last verse in section 1, we have John's statement that the 144,000 Jewish martyrs are blameless, and in the presence of God, and there is no deceit in their mouth. This was a contrast statement to his prophecy about the mouth in chapter 13, whom John prophesied would be very anti-Semitic and openly use deceit, which, as you know, was fulfilled in the coming of John Chrysostom. This text is a contrast statement concerning him. So this event is about John Chrysostom. We know from chapter 13, the mouth was a reference to the constellation Piscis Austinus, also known as the mouth of Piscis, the fish. And we know that John's reference to the martyrs refers to meteor showers. And because John is contrasting them as being in the presence of God, by way of contrast, John is prophesying something about the death of John Chrysostom. The mouth, from chapter 13. So we are looking for the occurrence of a meteor shower, in the constellation Piscis Austrinus, over the sky of where John Chrysostom was residing, during his life. Chrysostom was born, in the year 347 AD, in Antioch, Syria, and died in the year 407 AD, in Komana, Helena Pontus, which is near the modern city of Tokat, Turkey. When we look for this astronomical sign, we discover this precise astronomical event occurred September 14th, in the year 407 AD, over the very skies of Tokat, Turkey. And that is the last marker on our historical timeline for John's first section of prophecy. Next, we will look at the astronomical dating for John's second section of prophecy that occur in verse 6 through verse 13 and prophesy the coming of the three messengers. The reason astronomical dating is real, and all this really does work, as John wrote his own text to be interpreted, is because Pope Sixtus III really was 666 from Revelation chapter 13 verse 18. The holy fire, really, is the fire from heaven prophesied by John. The ash mark on the forehead or hand, really is the mark of the beast, and Christmas really is the worship of his image. And that is the reason you are now seeing astronomical dating explain so many mysteries in the book of Revelation. Because the community of real New Testament believers, who are the real theological descendants of John, are the people who possess this knowledge. And the ones condemning and replacing it with lies were the celibate Nicolaitans, and were the same ones being exposed by it. So naturally, they condemned it. While it is impossible to tell what the original star tables for astronomical dating looked like, because they were all confiscated and burned, it is probable that they reflected the original Hebrew names for the planets and constellations, because Athanasius complains they renamed astronomical bodies after the names of biblical saints, which was a practice of ascribing biblical references and persons to the stars and planets. Which you are seeing on your screen now, would have been such a star table, using Hebrew names. In this next section, in section 2, we get to the section of prophecy that deals with the three messengers. Although the three messengers are described with three separate messages, the astronomical event this text is prophesying is actually one event. What makes it recognizable as an astronomical event is that three markers simultaneously occur. These three markers are all described with movement, meaning they are references to planets. And because they come together in a group of three, what John is actually describing in the text is what some people would erroneously call a planetary conjunction of three planets. But that is actually the wrong term. It would be referred to as a planetary alignment, or a planetary triad. These three planets are all the same marker for just one event, which is the event horizon of what comes in the very next section. The three messengers are the astronomical prelude to this cataclysmic event. Anyone who wishes to claim this is not the correct interpretation of this text has completely ignored John's own instruction for interpreting the text he wrote. Because John states explicitly, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, that when he uses the term messenger, he is explicitly talking about stars, not pagan Greek Nikes. Sorry if you don't like that, but that was his instruction for understanding his own book. And if you refuse to understand it that way, despite his instruction to do so, then you're either willfully ignorant, or you're simply a rebellious deceiver, who rejects the truth about who and what John was, as well as the entire rest of the New Testament. When John said the word messengers, transliterated as angels, in order to accommodate pagan Greek Nikes, he was talking about things in the stars. That's simply the fact of the texts. So, astronomically speaking, what three planets are the three messengers? John gives the answer to that question in his astronomical template, which he continues to repeat throughout his book, and describes here in verses 6 through 12. Since we are focusing on astronomical dating in this video, even though the section is 6 verses long, which include the messages that each signifies, we are going to focus mainly on the 3 verses which give us the description of the 3 messengers. Beginning with verse 6 and the first messenger. In verse 6, we pointed out in our translation work, that the translators shift the meaning of the text to read the everlasting gospel. But that is not really what the text says in Greek. It says the messenger is the one having good news for eons and eons of time, or everlasting good news, if you wish to translate it that way. The messenger is the one who has the good news, forever. And that reads a little different. The messenger is the focus of the time frame, not what he says. And in John's template, that would be an astronomical reference to Christ, who is the good news. Not what he says, but who is the good news, precisely as the text actually really reads. In John's astronomical template, Aries is the fixed reference, but here we are definitely reading about moving bodies, so this would have to be a reference to the messenger Noga in Hebrew, or what we would call the planet Venus. Noga was the name of a son of David, and means the same thing as John's reference, bright and morning star. Noga means bright. The first messenger is Noga, or Venus. The second messenger is described in verse 8 as heralding that Rome, like Babylon, is fallen. That declaration is one concerning a moral and spiritual fall, involving corrupting and compromising all the people of the Roman Empire. Because John points to the reason for this being that they have given them the wine of prostitution to drink. Once again, John points to the act of drinking the wine, that is the offense. That Rome is committing a fraud. So what messenger brings this news? If you begin tracking John's astronomical template from the very beginning of the book, the very first ecclesia that John addresses is the city of Ephesus. In John's template for the 7 cities, the messenger for the ecclesia associated with discernment concerning the Nicolaitans and the coming of the Antichrist to the city of Ephesus is the messenger Kakab in Hebrew, which we refer to as the planet Mercury. Ephesus was where they exposed the Nicolaitans as false apostles, who said they were apostles, but were not, and did lie. That is precisely what the second messenger is doing, so the second messenger is Kakab, or Mercury as we know it, in pagan Roman Catholic English. The third messenger appears in verse 9, and brings a warning about the absolute Roman monarchy. Its message is that if you drink the wine, or if you take the mark, or if you worship the icon of this monarchy, you will be damned by God. Because this messenger is focused on the absolute monarchy, it is naturally the one that brings the messages about kingdoms and kingships, which is the messenger Shabbatai, or as we know it, in our paganized Roman Catholic English, the planet Saturn. So according to John's prophecy, he gives us 3 messengers that will bring 3 messages. Noga, Kakab and Shabbatai, or as we say in Babylon, Venus, Mercury and Saturn, which will be seen in the sky in that order, because he specifies in the text, one after another. But he doesn't give us the constellation position where this alignment, or trine, will take place. That is because he's already given it at the beginning of the chapter. In verse 1, it's the lambkin standing on Mount Zion. So what we are looking for as our astronomical markers are, first Venus, second Mercury, and third Saturn. 1, 2, 3, in that order, in the fixed constellation of Aries at a 45-degree incline, as a lambkin on Mount Zion. And we will see these things align at the beginning of a new moon. That was the significance of singing a new song, in verse 3. So we are looking for first Venus, secondly Mercury, and thirdly Saturn, in that order, in the constellation Aries, at a 45-degree incline on the horizon, during a new moon. And that is a lot of astronomical data. It would really honestly be impossible to miss this, and you certainly couldn't just make it up if it were not there. The details are so specific, there would be no way to fudge this. It's either there, or it's not. It's either real, or it's not. And that is our astronomical data for section 2. When we look into history to find this exact position astronomically, we discover precisely such an alignment actually really did occur on April 25, 526 AD. And so now we have found the sixth astronomical marker on our historical timeline on April 25, 526 AD. Next we will look at our last and final third section for John's astronomical dating for Revelation chapter 14. And after this last section is complete, we will be ready for the next video, in which we will go through and show the actual historical fulfillment of John's prophecies on the historical timeline. Next, however, we will look at our last prophetic section, which is section 3, beginning at verse 14 and going through verse 20. Now we are ready to examine the astronomical dating for section 3 of Revelation 14, which constitutes John's final section of prophecy for this chapter. And this section of prophecy is what everything has been leading up to. This is the climax of the chapter prophetically, and concludes in a prophecy concerning a cataclysmic event of utter destruction. As mentioned earlier, chapter 14 is prophesying additional things about events which have already been prophesied. John is adding details and contrasts to his earlier prophecies, so we actually already have event dates on the historical timeline for some of these events. But John is adding new detail to them. When we get to section 3, we have another event John is expanding on, which he had already previously prophesied. It was concerning the destruction of Antioch, which we covered in chapter 8. But as discussed in chapter 8, John's first prophecy implied the second destruction, but didn't spell it out in graphic detail, like he is now going to do in this text. In this text, John is going to make it absolutely unmistakable. He is going to spell it out in graphic detail, in such a way that it cannot be missed. He has already given the sign of the three messengers, which we have already located on our historical timeline, on April 25, 526 AD. We also already know he is prophesying the destruction of the city of Antioch in 526 AD from the sign in the heavens. So we already have the date of this event. What John is now going to do is add to details about his astronomical dating for this event that make identification of it beyond mistake, along with issuing his terribly stern warnings of absolute and unconditional eternal damnation for anyone participating or collaborating with the Roman religion of the Antichrist, Nicolaitans. And these details in the heavens, along with what will happen in history, will confirm in an unbelievably minute way the absolutely serious nature of these warnings. Since we already know the date of this event historically, we are going to go ahead and fill in the event date in the last column of our chart as March 20th, 526 AD. All the things that John is about to describe have to do with astronomical dating for that event, as you are about to see. When counter-reformationists try to preach Revelation chapter 14, they literally have no clue what they are even reading. They end up all over the map, and nowhere even close to the actual text. They can't even bring themselves to even admit John is talking about wine in the chapter. That is because they literally simply don't want to see what John has written. So they don't. And that is why you should not listen to their explanations, which will be a complete waste of your time and an offense to God. In verse 14, John describes a son of Adam in the clouds with a golden crown and a drepanon. The term drepanon is translated as the word sickle, but it is actually the word pruning hook, because what is being harvested is not a wheat field, but a wine vineyard. Even though the devices look similar, one is larger than the other, and a sickle is for harvesting wheat, whereas a pruning hook is for harvesting grapes. This is obviously astronomical dating in John's text. The entire scene takes place in the sky. The fact he mentions clouds indicates it will be a daytime event. John gives 3 identifiers: a crown, a hook, and a man. So we are looking for an astronomical position that has a man, a crown, and a hook. When we do that, we discover it is the constellation Boötes. Here is a picture of it on your screen. As you can see, there is the crown in the constellation Corona Borealis, there is the man in the constellation Boötes, and as you can see in his hand, he is holding a hook. It is no accident that John is using the constellation Boötes to mark the dating of his prophecy. Why is that? Because the star lore of the constellation Boötes perfectly illustrated his prophetic warning about drinking the wine of Rome he is now prophesying against. As you have already seen in this chapter, the constellation Virgo is being used prominently in previous texts, and now here, John is using Boötes. Listen to what the star lore was concerning the constellation Boötes, recorded by Gaius Julius Hyginus, who had been one of Rome's most famous astronomers who lived during the time of Augustus Caesar. According to Hyginus, quote, Icarius, who was schooled as a grape farmer and winemaker by Dionysius. Icarius made wine so strong that those who drank it appeared poisoned, which caused shepherds to avenge their supposedly poisoned friends by killing Icarius. Nara, Icarius' dog, brought his daughter Erigone to her father's body, whereupon both she and the dog committed suicide. Zeus then chose to honor all 3 by placing them in the sky as constellations, Icarius as Bootes, Erigone as Virgo. End quote. So you see, the Roman legend concerning the constellation Boötes was that he made poisonous wine, for which he was killed, and placed in the sky as Boötes. And his own daughter committed suicide, for which she was placed in the sky as Virgo. So there are some amazing parallels to John's prophecy over the illustration of Rome's poisonous wine and his use of this constellation. Now that we know John is referencing the constellation Boötes, we will go on to verse 15. Next, in verse 15, John begins mentioning the 3 messengers he described in verses 6 through 13. He begins with stating in verse 15 that a messenger came out of the temple. This statement, however, does not need to confuse you, because he states that all 3 come out of the temple. In New Testament theology, Christ was the temple. In the New Testament, whenever New Testament writers referred to the temple, they always applied that term either to Christ or the body of Christ, but never to the physical temple in Jerusalem, which Christ had called a dead carcass which God was finished with, in Matthew 24, and had actually prophetically associated with future Roman assemblies, in verse 28. By prophesying that the eagles would gather or assemble at the carcass. To learn more about this amazing prophecy, you can click the link to a Bible study on Matthew 24 in the video's description section below. The references in verse 15, 17 and 18 of coming out of the temple was simply the astronomical movements of the 3 planets or stars, as John calls them, from their previous position in Aries, the lambkin, standing on Mount Zion. That was the temple astronomically John was referring to, that they were all proceeding out of. He mentions the first messenger coming out of the temple in verse 15, then he mentions the second messenger coming out of the temple in verse 17, and states that the second messenger has a hook too, which makes his identification impossible to miss, and then he mentions the third messenger coming out of the temple in verse 18, and having fire from the sacrificial altar. So John gives 3 descriptors for each messenger. So we will now look at John's descriptors for each messenger, to quickly identify which is which in John's descriptions. And as you will see once again, John is being so precise and exact in his descriptions, these cannot possibly be missed, unless you just willfully do so. Which of course, the Counter-Reformation is completely dedicated to doing, at all costs. Even if it means your personal eternal damnation. And, even if they have to lie, to do it. As you see on your screen, there is the chart for how John describes these three messengers. In verse 15, he connects the first to giving the hour. In verse 17, he describes the second one as having a hook too, which is extremely unmistakable. And he describes the third as coming out from the sacrificial altar and having fire. John's reference to the sacrificial altar would be a constellation of a sacrificial animal. John's reference to fire would be a reference to the sun. So we are looking for one of these messengers, located in the constellation of a sacrificial animal, next to the sun. The last description is the easiest to identify, because it gives the most detail. So we will begin with it. If we look into the sky, on March 20, 526 AD, we discover precisely what John is describing in verses 15, 17 and 18. If you will notice, right above the horizon, is Venus, located right next to the sun, and in the constellation Taurus, the bull, which was a sacrificial animal sacrificed in the temple. So we can easily identify the third messenger as Venus, but that's not all. The second messenger mentioned in verse 17, was described as having a hook too. Amazingly, most people do not even know this, but as you can see, the planet Mercury just above the horizon, is located just beneath Venus, and Mercury is located in the constellation Gemini. But there is no hook in Gemini, right? When you think of the constellation Gemini, no one remembers a hook. But guess what? If you blow up the constellation Gemini, and take a close look at it, there actually is a hook in the hand, in Gemini. And that confirms John's second detail, that the second messenger has a hook as well. Just like the constellation Boötes, described in the clouds. Since the third messenger with the sacrificial altar and fire was Venus, and the second messenger with a hook too, was Mercury, that leaves Saturn as the first messenger, as you see there. So why would John associate Saturn with the phrase, the hour? Because remember, in Greek, Saturn was referred to by the name Chronos, and Chronos is also the word for time. So that fits perfectly. And now we have identified all three messengers precisely as John has described them, with everything he wrote in the text. In verse 16, John states that the one sitting on the clouds would thrust his hook into the land, meaning that Boötes will thrust his hook to the earth, which meant the hook of Boötes will descend onto the horizon, marking the commencement of the following events. When we look into the sky just before the destruction of Antioch on March 20, 526 AD, we see Boötes descending to the horizon, precisely as John describes. These are a sequence of screenshots of Boötes' descent to the horizon on March 20, 526 AD, just before the destruction of Antioch. In verse 17, John states that Mercury arises in a constellation with another hook, too. And as you already saw, that was a reference to the hook in Gemini. In verse 18, John refers to Venus, and the sacrificial altar, and having fire. Which you saw was the constellation Taurus, with a sun. Which we then also see happen, precisely as John describes. Then in verse 19, John says the messenger throws the hook into the land, meaning the second hook reaches the horizon, and the event commences. The earthquake with fire begins. Then in verse 20, blood comes out of the vat, for 1600 stades or approximately 180 miles. But this is also an astronomical reference as well. As you saw earlier, John refers to the four-horse constellations, located in the four corners of the sky, Pegasus, Centaurus, Sagittarius, and Monoceros. He doesn't identify which horse constellation he is referring to in his reference, but we should expect to find it located precisely on the horizon, just as he referenced the sickle or pruning hook in the hand of Boötes, and Gemini. And when we do look into the sky over Antioch on March 20, 526 AD, amazingly, Precisely as John described, we find the bridle of Monoceros located on the exact horizon, 2 hours later, on the horizon of the city of Antioch, and thus John's astronomical dating for this event was completely fulfilled, precisely as John had prophesied it. Down to the minute details of 3 messengers, one with fire, one with a second hook and one with time. The hook being thrust into the earth, and the horse's bridle on the horizon, indicating death and destruction, for 180 miles wide. And now we have completed our last and final astronomical marker on our historical timeline. And we will place it on March 20th, 526 AD. And with that last marker, we have now reconstructed our historical timeline for Revelation chapter 14. That concludes video number 51, on the astronomical dating, for Revelation chapter 14, and as you can see, astronomical dating, is what Revelation chapter 14, is really all about. That is what the lambkin on Mount Zion is all about. That is what the liars and liar players are all about. That is what the virgins are all about. That is what the new song, Around the Throne, is all about. That is what the 3 messengers in the sky were describing. And that is the prophetic event the Counter-Reformation has been intentionally hiding from the world since the 6th century AD. Even if intentionally hiding that information from people is endangering their very salvation. And now you see why the Counter-Reformation is not simply another version of Christianity, it is an Antichrist movement, which descends from the original celibate Nicolaitans bishops of Antioch, Syria, and the original sponsors of the coming of the Antichrist to the city of Ephesus, warned about in the New Testament. And as you can clearly see, nothing in chapter 14 of Revelation has anything to do with a rapture, or a fictitious tribulation period, or the Battle of Armageddon. It is about God's condemnation of Rome's replacement of the real blood and flesh of Christ in the Passover meal with something it called a Mass, as in Christ Mass. And celebrating it is doing precisely what John told you not to do, with warnings concerning your own eternal salvation. And that is something that the Counter-Reformation doesn't want anyone to ever hear about, no matter what the consequences could be, for anyone's soul. In the next video, we will conclude chapter 14, with an examination of the historical fulfillment of John's prophecies, recorded in Revelation chapter 14. And as you will see, they have all been fulfilled in history, and are verifiably fulfilled and complete, along with John's astronomical dating, which make that fact a certainty. 666 has already come in history. His name was Pope Sixtus III. Thank you for watching.